How to get fat 101, how to maximize your bulk and prioritize obesity. We're going to break it down for you here today in this episode.
Yep.
So, we got a question. A question was left on a recent post that I made, and this is something that I've seen many people do, as I'm sure Adam has. I've been asked this quite a few times before as well. But the person asked, is eating higher fats during a bulk better because it's easier for them to get down more calories?
And it's basically the dirty bulking mentality of, sure, you could eat healthy foods that are higher in fats, but a lot of times people are going to make the excuse of just calories in, calories out. You just got to eat big to get big. But that's really just not the case with putting on muscle tissue. There is a point where you do need to gain a little bit of body fat over a period of time as you're building muscle, but that shouldn't be your goal of I'm going to get fat so that I can put on muscle. You want to be putting on muscle tissue with a little bit of fat accumulation over time.
Yeah, so you said something there. You said dirty bulking. And I do want to know, it doesn't necessarily have to be dirty bulking because we've seen people do this, right? They'll pour avocado oil into their shake. They'll just add in additional absurd amounts of fat because their priority is hitting a caloric value and they think that's what's going to attribute to muscle growth. So just, pouring oil down your shakes, adding peanut butter to everything, just trying to add in easier calories. Doesn't necessarily have to be dirty calories, but they're just focused on a more condensed, higher calorically dense food sources to utilize in a bulk.
Right. It could be even eating just 80-20 ground beef or 70-30, and, just because it has more fats, so it's going to be more calorically dense. Or, having crazy types of shakes with, olive oil and uh, condensed milk and, stuff like this that isn't really going.
Drinking milk.
Yeah. I mean, I like drinking milk.
Other people will pound milk. I mean, milk is
Yeah.
not the
No, but
worst.
like,
Milk
there's
is.
like heavy whipping cream, like just like
Mhm.
straight, just like calorically dense, high fat foods and liquids to just get the calories in. And I think there's
Mhm.
a much smarter way to go about getting your calories in. One, to prevent as much fat gain, but two, to potentially store more glycogen by eating more carbs and not as many fats. Because I guess it would be the first reason is which one of these are going to be stored as glycogen,
Mhm.
carbs.
Well, what we basically need to break down from the start here is there's a fundamental flaw in this thinking process, and it goes into the whole concept of people looking at things with a very narrow scope and seeing it as calories in, calories out, or just the total amount of macros. But people who are doing this really aren't even necessarily focused on just hitting macros. I think if they're just trying to build a caloric intake with fats, maybe do they just have their fat allowance that high to hit however many calories they need? When I think there's, for one, a huge misunderstanding with a lot of people. They don't actually realize how many calories they do need. Some people do need a lot, but in my experience, I've found that a lot of people, especially in the general population who are trying to maximize muscle growth, don't need as much as they think they do. But there's a fundamental flaw in this thought process because people don't understand how muscle building actually works. So why don't we break that down here and talk about what actually causes muscle growth and how it is not just attributed to having a higher caloric value? Because I think people think that because calories are energy, that the more energy they have, the better performance they're going to have in general, which is going to lead to better gains.
To an extent, that's the idea, is eat enough to optimize your performance and your energy and your glycogen, all of that in the gym, and to be able to recover from your training. So you want to eat enough to be able to do that, but it's not linear. It's not like you're taking a drug and the more you take, the more effects you get. There's a cap of how much food is really going to continue helping your performance. And then you're going to get into diminishing returns where now you're going to feel sluggish in the gym. You're going to decrease your insulin sensitivity, so you're going to get worse pumps and potentially build muscle even slower to an extent. And so it's not necessarily the fact that more food equals more performance always. It's just to a certain point, and that is how we're going to be able to structure our diet to optimally build muscles. eating enough carbs, eating enough protein, and eating enough fat so that we can optimize our performance. And then beyond that, we don't necessarily need to gain more fat.
So you said there the issue with overeating and contributing to its insensitivity. And I don't want to get into this because we already have covered this so many fucking times, but you said that it's going to contribute to worse pumps. And I feel like some people nowadays with the exercise science-based crowd, know-it-alls, they're going to think, well, the pump doesn't really matter. I'm sure you could go down that rabbit hole if you want. I'm not even going to get into that. But you also said that it could potentially lead to worse gains. I think that's really where the major issue with that comes into is the worst nutrient partitioning, which can have a negative impact not only on health, but the potential progress you see and an ability to utilize those nutrients, which does directly correlate to the pump that you're going to get. So it's not like, oh, just because your pump's going to be worse, that necessarily alone means that the progress is going to be worse. The pump being worse is a byproduct of what's going on. But a lot of people will also hear this and say, well, carbs aren't a necessary macronutrient. It's the one macronutrient that's not necessary. Well, true, because other macronutrients can get converted into glucose for the tissues that need it through gluconeogenesis. All right, due to technical difficulties on Adam's end of the spectrum, because he's using a 2004 Dell,
2005.
2005 Dell.
That was
it
like
crashed.
2020, 2021, I think.
Yeah, well, it's too old that it crashed. So we're going to pick back up. I think what I was saying there was I was basically talking about how people were going to say that carbs are not, they're not an essential macronutrient, right? That's what I was going with. And because other macronutrients like protein can get converted to glucose through gluconeogenesis. But in a bodybuilding context, the hierarchy that I was stating was protein would be number one, of course. Carbs would be number two. Fats would be number three. Not to say that we don't need fats, but carbs are what are going to be primarily driving performance. And then proteins, obviously, shouldn't have to be stated, is the most important for muscle recovery and anabolism, right? So, how do you feel about that?
I mean, I agree. I don't think people need carbs. You don't even need carbs to survive. That's obviously, the keto diet and the Atkins, whatever. You don't need carbs. But if we're talking about what's optimal for bodybuilding and building muscle, I would definitely say keto isn't optimal. I would definitely say eating carbs. If I were to pick between, and it depends on the person as well, some people will respond better to higher carbs and lower fats and vice versa. But for myself and most people, I would say most people are going to respond better to having enough carbs in their diet to support their training. You don't hear very often where people are getting crazy pumps full of glycogen on a ketogenic diet, where they're not eating really any carbs. So if we're trying to talk from the perspective of somebody who's trying to build muscle effectively and efficiently and optimally, I would say, yes, protein is the most it's the only essential macronutrient. But besides that, for building muscle, yes, you need protein for the muscle protein synthesis to actually build the muscle proteins. Fats are beneficial for hormonal reasons if you're natural. Um, you know, it can help with satiety. That's a huge benefit of having fats in your diet, especially if you're in a deficit. But for the performance aspect, really, I would just throw in as many carbs as you can eat while still in a deficit, or if you're in a surplus without getting too fat. So that's my opinion on that.
So you said protein is the only necessary macronutrient, right? Why do you say that fats are not necessary?
Um, well, I'm saying an essential nutrient. Uh, Technically, fats are an essential nutrient because you wouldn't really be able to survive on just protein alone. You could convert it into glucose, and then you can convert it into fats, but you could technically just survive on protein alone. It just wouldn't be very uh, easy. So yes, you need fats for hormone production. You need it for cell membrane structure, and then obviously for energy. You use fats for all the activity that you do, and it's a much more efficient system having fats in your body for energy. Just to be talking on this podcast, just to be going on a walk, to be doing anything that uses fats for energy, by eating fats.
No,
but
no, no.
we have fat on our body to use for energy.
Well, let me see if I got this right because you went to school for this, so I'm sure you can articulate it better. With protein being the only essential macronutrient at the end of the day, because you often don't hear people say this, we know that protein can get converted into glucose through gluconeogenesis. But then glucose, you often hear people, you don't often, but fructose is what this is typically referred to. And people say this can get converted into fats through, I believe it's de novo lipogenesis. Is that correct? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. Talking about converting glucose into fats. Yeah. Lipogenesis.
So that could initially just starting with the protein could go into glucose, then into a fat through
You
that
could.
process.
It's just a long process. So that really just brings up the argument of if you give somebody an all protein diet, it's going to be very hard for them to get fat for two reasons. One, because it takes a lot of energy to convert protein into glucose into triglycerides, but also protein is very satiating and it's hard to eat a lot of protein, especially if you're getting it from whole food sources. So that's why I tell people, especially who are just trying to lose weight, beginners, people who are just obese, don't be afraid of protein. They say, oh, but it's bad for your kidneys. Oh, too much protein is unhealthy. You already have many things that are wrong with your health. Too much protein, and it's not even too much protein, but like a lot of protein is the least of your worries. And it's going to help you lose body fat in order to, uh, actually improve your health and health markers to where a little extra protein is not actually going to negatively affect your health, um, because it's not going to be stored as fat generally. It can be, but it's generally not going to be.
I'm just mentioning that for the sake of saying that fats are not essential because if the body needs it, it can go through that process. It's just a very expensive process, and really, protein is always the priority at the end of the day. Protein can take care of other needs if need needed.
Yeah, exactly. You can get energy from the fats that you have on your body to an extent. I mean, you only have so much fat on your body, but if you were to eat, let's say you were to go, a week or a month eating just one macronutrient, you could survive eating just protein. But if you don't eat protein for that long, and I'm talking about like zero protein, like if your carbs have trace proteins, your fats have trace proteins, sure. I mean, generally carbs are gonna have more trace proteins, but you're gonna be able to survive. But if you're eating just straight sugar and oil and no protein, you're not getting any of the nitrogen from your food, and you need that for amino acids and to be able to not just build muscle, but all of the processes in your body. You produce proteins like ribosomes from DNA, which translates into RNA, and that helps you to be able to recover, dead skin cells, and just so many things that happen in your body from protein beyond just building muscle that you can't get that from carbs or fats because those only have carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen just in different forms, and fats have a lot more of them. Um, where you need so proteins have carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, so you can make fats and carbs or glucose out of protein, but neither glucose or fats have nitrogen, so you can't make protein out of them. And
Hmm.
sure, you could break down protein, but like your body would prefer not to have to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that if you are focused on retaining tissue or trying to maximize growth, that having an abundance of protein in your diet is the smartest thing you can do. Anybody arguing for the zero point 0.8 grams per pound of body weight, um, I will never get on board with that, and I don't think anybody that has any significant amount of muscle tissue will ever get on board with it either, because we never see it actually play out. But this is kind of getting further away from the point, right? So, because the topic here is why eating higher fats during a bulk is not going to necessarily contribute to more progress. So again, we understand the role of protein, right? Protein is going to spike anabolism, stimulate muscle protein synthesis. You want to continuously do this throughout the day to keep yourself in an anabolic state, to maximize the growth potential, right? Carbohydrates stored as muscle glycogen. That's going to therefore help with performance, which obviously has a benefit in the bigger picture of things: better performance, better potential for progression. And then fats, to some extent, you don't need a ton of fats, is going to support basic hormonal function. Anything you want to add on to that, Adam?
Well, I mean, I could talk forever about this, but there are caveats to it. Of example people who may benefit from having more fats in their diet. So we're just saying from like a physiological perspective, do you necessarily need fats in order to build muscle? Besides the hormonal aspect, no, because you're generally going to get cholesterol from the fat sources. Not all fat sources, but um,
And you don't need a ton of fats for that basic hormonal
no,
support.
no.
Yes. Okay.
So besides that aspect, you don't really need fats in your diet. But for some people, in reality, they can't eat enough carbs in order to get enough calories in, to where they're just burning through all those carbs for energy, when they could also be burning through more fats and using those carbs that they're eating to be stored as glycogen. So that'll also help them get enough food, and it is increasing the calorie density. But there's a caveat to that as well. It's a catch 22 of, yes, you eat more fats, but that's also going to slow your digestion, and that's going to make it kind of a little bit harder for some people to eat their next meal, because it's going to slow your digestion and make it harder to where you're fuller for longer. You take longer to digest it. So yes, you're getting more calories in one meal, but it might potentially make it harder for you to get enough meals in throughout the entire day. So it really depends on the person. But for most people, especially those who are just have a regular metabolism, regular physique, you know, aren't an extreme level of, like crazy fast metabolism, something like that, you don't need that high of fats in order to build muscle.
Hmm. Now, let's take this step by step. So, first thing I'll say is this is a this whole idea of people doing this stems from, again, the fundamental misunderstanding of how muscle building works, and ideas like calories in, calories out, if it fits your macros, being a hot topic across social media. Both of these things are bullshit. Calories in, calories out is not going to be indicative of your ability to build muscle. Obviously, calories play a role. If it fits your macros in a general sense, most people look at it just as the numbers. They don't look at what those macronutrients are actually comprised of, and they completely disregard things like nutrient timing and all of that stuff, which all plays into maximizing muscle growth. It's not just throwing on a bunch of additional calories, even if they are from good sources. Now, somebody who you gave the example of somebody being a super high metabolic functioning person who's just burning through glucose, and I think a lot of guys that are skinny guys are going to hear that, be like, oh, that's me, I have a fast metabolism. And in 90% of cases, I'm
No.
also going to say it's bullshit. These
Yeah.
guys just don't know how to eat and don't eat enough. Like, somebody having that extreme metabolic function where they're just burning through food all the time is, it's very rare. It's not likely. um I think a lot of people just want to have something to point to and say, "Oh, that's me. I'm the hard gainer. I need to eat like this," and they just
100%.
don't actually. They've never actually eaten 5 or 6 consistent meals, how they should be for maximizing growth. So they just jump the gun on that. But the issues that come with doing this, with trying to add on additional fats, are, like you mentioned. For one, slowing digestion down, your inability to get your following meals in, or even having a negative impact on digestion, which can ultimately negatively impact the absorption of that food, right? If you are just trying to force food because you now have this ultra satiation and you're causing this effect because you think it's higher calories, but now you feel more satiated and you're trying to stuff food down, but you're not properly digesting that food, which is ultimately, I would say, is going to have a negative impact on the progress you see. How do you feel about that?
And then it also can negatively affect your appetite, not just from the satiety, but also just from just too many fats, just in your stomach, in your small intestine. Uh, there's just, in my opinion, I just, yes, I'll be fuller, but I'll also kind of be turned off away from food. I can't necessarily describe what it is, but it's just, if you're eating too many fats, you feel a little greasy, you feel a little gross. You don't want to necessarily eat more food. Versus when I'm like, I was eating a bunch of red meat. I was eating red meat 3 to 4 times a day, and I brought it back down to once a day and replaced them with, chicken and just like leaner sources. And yes, I probably pulled back on the calories by doing that, but also just the fact that I switched from higher fats to lower fats, my appetite fucking shot through the roof. And it's 100% because, and it's not necessarily that like I get like more and more hungry, all the time. It's the fact that I'm getting hungrier sooner, because the fats aren't slowing the digestion down. So it really is going to be very beneficial for bulking. And
Blood
so,
sugar.
and well, so with fats, that's one benefit with fats is that it's going to benefit your blood sugar in terms of not having a huge spike. So that is good for insulin sensitivity to an extent, as long as you're not
But it
getting
can also
fat.
be negative.
As long as you're not getting fat, yeah. But if you're eating and a slight surplus and you're eating some fats with your meals, it'll make it a little bit easier to absorb it because you're not having a huge spike in carbs. But then to counteract that point, you're also eating the carbs with protein. So you're also slowing the digestion down from eating protein as well. So
Yeah, but I was saying that that could also be negative because now that you're slowing that digestive down, yes, it could be good in a sense for insulin sensitivity, but it's also going to affect the appetite, right? Because if you
yes.
could have a shorter, spike and then that drops down, whenever your blood sugar drops, you get hungry.
Hmm.
So if
Well,
you're
definitely.
limiting that and you're having this slower release, again, there's I don't want to say one is better than the other, but there's a trade off here, right?
Yeah.
And this is why in the past I have used this is not advocating. I've touched on this already in the podcast before, where we've used small doses of insulin just to bring my blood glucose down. If I read it, took it, and saw that it was above 100 or whatever, and I still didn't feel hungry, I would take a couple IU's, blood sugar would drop down to 80, immediately make it easier to eat. So that's kind of the point that I'm making here is having that slower release has some pros to it, but there's also potential cons, and that all is going to depend on the person because appetite is not solely correlated to blood glucose either. There's all different functions across individuals that determine that.
Right. And then also, let's say somebody who's eating a higher fat meal or just a bigger meal in general, that is going to take longer to digest. But also, there's other factors that play into it. So one is just the person's just ability to digest food. Some people can digest faster and slower. But also, what are you doing after you eat a meal? Are you laying down or are you getting up and walking? That's also going to have an effect on you on how you digest it. So, and then also how much protein are you eating, and then what kind of protein source is it? Are you having a protein source that doesn't necessarily digest very well for you? If you're someone that can't really eat Greek yogurt or egg whites or something like that, even though it's a lean protein source, maybe it's just sitting in your stomach for a long time. Or what if you're having a lot of fiber with it as well? There's a lot of factors that play into how long something takes to digest, which is going to affect when you get hungry again. And that's really, if you're trying to talk about building muscle and being able to eat enough food to build muscle, that's just how I would look at it, is to be able to digest your food quickly enough while obviously not eating too much food in general, to where you're putting on body fat, but also to where you're digesting quick enough to get the next meal in and not be full all the way up until it's time to eat your next meal.
Hmm. I think in the most simplistic way to put it, because it doesn't get any more simple than this, in my opinion, is that if you're trying to maximize muscle growth, it comes down to trying to make the most use out of the nutrients that you're intaking and not just looking at arbitrary numbers, right? Even when it comes to protein, carbs, fats, anything, it doesn't matter if it's just 300, 200, I can just get in 500 more calories. It's like, what is happening with that 500 calories? What is happening with that 10 grams of fat? What is happening with that 30 grams of protein? And how is it actually benefiting you? What is the mechanism? What is going on that is contributing to growth?
Explain that a little more, because I know what you're saying, but I feel like you could explain that a little more too.
So what I'm saying is, if you eat, let's say I just eat, but I'm following it fits your macros, and I'm just only focused on hitting 200 grams of protein, 400 grams of carbs, 50 grams of fat, or whatever, or maybe I'm not even counting. I'm just eating these foods, right? You know, say I'm gonna have a shake. I'm at work. I'm gonna have a shake for my pre workout shake. Right. I'm gonna have some whey. I'm gonna have some fucking carb powder in there. Maybe some Rice Krispie treats, whatever. But then I'm gonna add some fucking avocado in the oil there, or there oil in there too, right? Because I'm trying to get a head start on my caloric intake. I want to make sure that I'm getting my fats in. At that point in time of the day, what is that fat doing for you that's beneficial? Nothing. It's going to have more than likely a negative impact.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. 100%.
This is going to slow the digestion down. You want the carbs. You want fast, quick absorption going into a workout. And you don't want things to still be digesting. It's going to not really be beneficial for your goals whatsoever at that time. It's just you're looking at it through the scope of I need fats, I need calories, but your body doesn't just know, oh, I need this intake this day. It knows what it receives at that time, and then it does something with that nutrient. So it's planning accordingly and mapping your day out around to have your fats at certain times where it makes sense to, If you're somebody who feels like you're always very hungry and you are burning through food, then maybe it makes more sense to add some fats in after every meal, just because you're somebody who might overeat and end up, you have a higher predisposition to just get fatter. So it's trying to combat that and keep yourself more satiated in a bulk. Or if you're somebody who has a very hard time eating, maybe it makes more sense for you to have no fats at all until basically your last two meals, because that way you're able to get in the first three or four without any issue.
100%. So you would say that the main thing for people to look at would be when they're eating their pre-workout meal, in terms of how much time between the pre-workout meal and when they go to the gym, and what that pre-workout meal consists of. That's a pretty important one. But then also, obviously depends on how they feel. If they feel sluggish versus if they feel hungry, that's going to determine what they eat, how much they eat. But then also before bed, that's a big one. I think with some people respond better to having a little more fats, and some people respond better to having a little more carbs, and some people don't even need carbs. And even taking away carbs in certain meals, whether it's on rest days, whether it's you know before bed, and then also as I said, pre-workout, some people also would benefit more from having a little bit of fats pre-workout and just taking an extra 30 minutes or so to digest, because then they have a more steady stream of nutrients from their small intestine into their bloodstream for the entire workout, where they just might benefit better from doing that. And because if they're always getting hungry in the middle of their workout, throw a little bit of fats in there, throw a tablespoon of peanut butter or a little bit of oil or whatever in not pre-workout. I shouldn't say right before you get to the gym, but with your pre-workout meal, hour and a half or so, hour, 2 hours, whatever, before the gym, that might benefit some people. So it really just comes down to trial and error and see what works best for you, because there is no like one set, this is how it should be for every single person,
Mm-hmm.
right?
It comes to, yeah, trial and error, understanding your body, how you feel on certain things, and obviously having a core understanding of these nutrients and what they do, nutrient timing, when it would make sense for you to implement these things with things taken into consideration. Like if you're somebody who, like I've had guys who they wake up in the morning, they never have any appetite, right? So those people, I usually have them eat no carbs before bed, right? It's usually just protein, maybe some veggies. And in my experiences, this has helped them gain an appetite so they're able to get that first meal in,
Yep.
right? When you have to give somebody a bigger meal, sometimes it makes, they don't have an appetite in the morning. And so what, that you just change your day around. It's not always that black and white. Like it may just not be the optimal way that you want to go about things for your specific circumstances. So you need to figure out how to really approach that. But then also there's the whole concept of fats are more easily stored as fat, right? So a lot of people
Mm-hmm.
overeat fats just to try to get that caloric value. Maybe they'll sacrifice some carbs to get into their caloric goal and have higher fats with it. But now fats, like I said, they're also more easily stored. You also hear people say, like I said before, people will talk about fructose going through de novo lipogenesis, which I think only really is a factor if you're over consuming. And I think that really comes more so from like people eating like high fructose corn syrup and eating a bunch of processed shit. So I mean, that's another thing too. If you're constantly eating out, eating high processed foods and a bunch of shit, that's obviously going to be much more likely converted and stored as fat. Um, so you don't want to. I don't want to say you don't want to have a higher fat diet, because again, it depends on the person. But it's just things to take into consideration. Your metabolic rate for some person, even though there might be signs that they would want to have higher fats in the diet, it could also be counterproductive in some aspect if they're storing that. No.
Yeah. So voice was correct. So the way that I would go about it is, first eat as many carbs as you can. Obviously, having your protein set, at whatever amount that you need and that you can eat. Then continuing to titrate your carbs up and see how much you can actually eat. And that's also including, bump up the rice and then add in some fruit juices, some honey, things that aren't solid, carb sources like the rice, potatoes, whatever. Then once you've maxed out the carbs of what you can eat, still not putting on body fat, then you can start to throw in the fats for a little bit of that extra, calorie intake, as long as it's not negatively affecting your digestion. Because the mindset that I'd like to have is, which one of these nutrients is going to be stored as glycogen, but also which one's going to have a larger increase in insulin. So if you have a meal that has more carbs and less fats, that's going to have a larger spike in insulin, which people say, oh, it's a bad thing. There was those videos we were talking about that, insulin is the terrible, hormone, but really it's an anabolic hormone. It's going to be shuttling these nutrients into the muscle, but yes, also into the fat. It just depends on where you're timing it. So if you're, you
Mhm.
know, in a large surplus and you're spiking your insulin with a bunch of carbs, before bed, probably not the best idea. But if you're in a deficit, this let me just explain this. This is the problem that people have with misinformation on the internet. You can eat a big meal before bed if you're either, controlling your calories where you're not in a huge surplus, or even if you're in a deficit. These people who are trying to lose weight thinking, oh, I can't eat carbs before bed, it is physically impossible to put on body fat if you're in a calorie deficit. So yes, you can eat all your carbs before bed if you wanted to. But anyways, that was a little side tangent.
Wait, 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 wait.
But
Give me an item that has high fructose corn syrup in it.
Dr. Pepper.
Dr. Pepper. Okay, there we go. Right. So this is again. This is I want to reiterate this because this is why quality and timing matters. Right. So I'm going to give you an example and tell me what you think about this. Say I just had a good big fat fucking meal. I had some chicken. I had 100 grams of carbs from rice. It had some fruit in there. Had some veggies. Right. I'm full. I assuming all that protein is gonna be utilized for anabolism, muscle protein synthesis, at least most of it. If not, fine. The carbs are gonna be mostly stored as glycogen. They're gonna be put to use. But now, say I do this post workout, right? Because post workout, you're very insulin sensitive, and again, insulin is transporter. Doesn't just transport glucose, transports fats as well. Now, if I have Dr. Pepper with that and I've already maxed out my capability to store glycogen at that moment, is that additional carbohydrate source from the high fructose corn syrup much more likely to get now converted into fats and stored as fat
It's any carb source,
because it was
right?
all it had at that one specific meal at that time? Well,
There's
it's any carb source, but you always hear that fructose is much more likely to be converted. That's why I'm bringing up the Dr. Pepper because it's a source.
right. So I would say fructose itself is definitely different than high fructose corn syrup. Because if we're talking about fructose, that's again going into a myth where like people think, oh, fruit is going to make you fat because it has fructose, and
But
fruit can
you're not gonna overeat fat with high fructose corn syrup. You'd easily
right.
have 50 grams of carbs from high fructose fucking corn syrup.
Exactly, yeah. And I'm pretty sure there's a bunch of other issues with high fructose corn syrup as well. But um, in terms of it being able to be stored as fat, then yes, of course, it's even just the simple fact of it's a simple sugar. Just spiking your insulin like that, with the fact that you said your glycogen levels are already full, then yes, you're going to be storing that as fat. I've seen the claims that high fructose corn syrup can be uh, or just fructose in general can be more easily stored as fats, but that there's the caveat to that of it's not the fructose from fruit, and overeating strawberries is going to make you fat, or bananas. um, you don't see a 300-pound person like those damn bananas, they got to me. um,
I think it
but
has something to do with the liver. I'm not entirely sure though.
Yeah, so what is it? It's fructose goes to the liver to be converted or to be broken down into glucose. And so it's a different mechanism of how you break down fructose versus glucose. I'm too what's the word? Blurry on it right now. I'd have to
Yeah,
refresh my
fructose
mind on
must
it.
be converted by the liver to glucose
Right. Okay. Yeah.
before it can be used as an energy source, but it
Yeah.
also has a higher predisposition to be converted into fat for whatever reason, which I am not going to read all up on that right now. But there is for whatever reason a higher likelihood for high fructose corn syrup to be converted to fat compared to obviously because then glucose needs to go through de novo lipogenesis when fructose could go straight into that. Is that correct?
I guess that sounds familiar. I think that's probably what it is.
Don't quote
Something
me
like
on
that.
that.
Something like that. I don't remember off the top of my head. When I learned shit in college, I really just tried to memorize it for exams, and then I'd get it out of my head. So a lot of the shit that I wanted to actually learn had to do with like hormones and like the endocrinology and that kind of stuff. I felt like learning about, the macronutrients and those kinds of things with the metabolism of those, that was interesting. and I, learned a lot of things, but a lot of it just kind of just
Just
push it out
drawing
of my
blanks
head.
on it.
No, I just push it out of my head because it's just like it's so much nuance to something that's so simple where I could be learning about shit that's actually interesting. Because nutrition is really it's really simple. We can make it really complex, and try to really figure out the nitty-gritty of things, but at the end of the day, I'm not going to say it's calories in, calories out. It's definitely not that simple. But the simplicity of it being, don't be a dumbass with your food, you know, eat your meals, time them accordingly with your workouts, with your sleep, with your schedule. Um, Monitor your progress based on how you feel in the gym, how you look in your physique, your body weight. Um, Eat high quality food sources. There's just the obvious fact of like, oh, maybe we shouldn't be eating high fructose corn syrup. There's the science based crowd that says, oh, let's challenge these things and see if they aren't that bad. Where it's just like, I would just rather just stick with what's always worked. Why eat a bunch of processed bullshit? Like just because you can build muscle on Diet Sprite and Diet Mountain Dew. Like,
Oh, I got the answer. All right,
yeah,
ready?
yeah,
Let's see if you can remember this.
okay,
So fructose is primarily metabolized in the liver, unlike glucose, which is used by a ton of different tissues in your body. Fructose is almost exclusively processed in the liver, and the specific pathway is critical because it influences how fructose is handled and stored. When fructose is consumed, it is phosphorylated. Am I even saying that right? Phosphorylated.
phosphorylated.
Phosphorylated to fructose 1 phosphate in the liver. This process bypasses the major regulatory step of
That's right.
glycolysis, which
That's right.
which normally involves glucose being converted to glucose 6 phosphate. The metabolism fructose rapidly generates intermediates that can enter pathways leading to the production of triglycerides. Specifically, fruit metabolism leads to the production of acetyl
CoA.
CoA, other intermediates that are directly used for fatty acid synthesis. High levels of fructose in the liver stimulate lipogenesis. The liver converts excess fructose into fatty acids through a process called, so it does go through de novo lipogenesis. The process is less regulated compared to glucose metabolism, which means that fructose can more readily be turned into fat.
Makes sense. You're basically skipping a few steps in glycolysis because in the steps of glycolysis, you convert, and again, this is stuff that I used to memorize, like glucose into this, into this, into this. And then one of those things is fructose 1,6 bisphosphate or something like that. And then that's converted into all these things. It's just kind of skipping a bunch of steps. So it's a lot quicker and a lot easier to convert it into fatty acids that glucose can be converted into as well. Because after glycolysis, you convert it into pyruvate, and then that goes through the Krebs cycle to be converted into acetyl CoA and a bunch of other things, and then that can go be used for lipogenesis to be able to uh, take a fatty acid and bind it to a glycerol, and then you get a triglyceride, and then that gets stored into adipose tissue.
Yeah. So the example that I was giving, basically, you're eating in a surplus, your chicken, rice, then you have, soda with that. The point that I'm basically trying to get is if you were to have, if you're already in this surplus, the likelihood of you having maybe that same amount of carbohydrates from additional rice versus the Dr. Pepper, the Dr. Pepper has a higher likelihood of just being converted into fat rather than stored as glycogen. Would you say that's correct?
Yeah, and then also
Likelihood, not necessary.
no, I mean I'm also saying there's also the glycemic index aspect as well, where it's just going to digest a lot quicker, potentially because of the fact that it has more fructose and high fructose corn syrup, but the fact that it's just got less starch in it. So it's going to digest quicker, break down a lot easier, have a much larger spike into your bloodstream, larger spike of insulin. And then that means that there's more shuttling of these nutrients somewhere. And there's only so fast that you can uptake these nutrients into the muscle. So that's why I say like slower digesting foods generally can be better for insulin sensitivity, because if you're just pounding the muscle with glucose and insulin, you're going to have a much better chance at storing more glycogen potentially. It always depends. Versus if you were to have a slower release, you could potentially store more glycogen. Versus a faster release, you'll potentially store less as glycogen and more into fat.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you can
Because
also slow the release with fiber too.
with fiber, fats, protein, the glycemic index of the carb itself, but the fiber, fat, and protein affect the glycemic load. But it all affects how quickly it gets absorbed into your bloodstream.
Okay. All right. So I think we pretty much. Is there anything we didn't touch on with regards to the issue with eating the higher fats necessarily? Like essentially why it's not necessarily a good idea for somebody to just throw avocado oil into their shake for the sake of having fats. I feel like at this point the people should pretty much get a gist of that.
Right, which is funny because I used to put olive oil and ice cream into my mass gainer protein shakes. Like I would make my own mass gainer shakes. I wouldn't. I knew well enough to not buy the mass gainers from GNC, but I would make my own with protein powder, uh, whole milk, ice cream, olive oil, uh, bananas, frozen strawberries. You know, I'd make my own, and that's because I was probably like I don't know in high school, and I think it's funny because it's a real thing. People still do it, and so it's good that we're talking about this and letting people know that hey, it's not just about the total calories that you're eating. It's really about maybe making them a little bit cleaner in terms of more carbs, less fats, but still the same amount of calories because you might be able to store more of those into the muscle as glycogen and be able to build more muscle than if you were to just have more fats because those fats really aren't doing anything and potentially are going to be more likely to be stored as body fat
Mm-hmm.
and potentially
Yeah,
have
I
more
mean,
of a
I
negative
think
effect on sensitivity.
for I would say at least 90% of my clients, I have everybody on. For the most part, everybody's on low fats. Like low fats, I mean
Yeah.
under 90 for the most part. 90 is like the high end if somebody's really pushing food. And again, this is because so many guys will come to me. I'm sure they've come to you too, and I don't have a big appetite, or I'm they struggle to eat a lot. It's because their previous diet was shit, and they were eating whatever, whenever they were having fats at any point in time. There's no structure to the diet, and it's just because they don't understand these things, or they're just not mapping out accordingly. And when you get them on a diet like this, or at least when I have, and you start them in this proper way, fats are kept low. We're prioritizing nutrient timing, making use of these nutrients. They're able to get the food down. And even at first, you start somebody at like, a low caloric intake. It's still hard for them to get down because they have not even, they're not used to eating that volume of normal food to begin with. But then you
Mhm.
titrate them up. You get them used to that, and then they're eating 3,500 calories, and their appetite is firing. Everything is at a good rate, and they're like, oh, I've never felt like this before. I always felt like shit trying to force food down. It's because there was no structure in place, and they were always just focused on trying to hit numbers rather than being strategic with it.
Great example is I just signed a client yesterday and he told me what his diet is. And his first meal alone was 8 whole eggs and 10 slices of turkey bacon and 100 grams of oats and whatever else he put in there. I think peanut butter too. And so 8 eggs
That's
is
pretty
what, like
fucking crazy. I can't even eat. I could never eat that.
just the 8 eggs alone is what, like 40 grams of fat plus the turkey bacon is like another 40 grams of fat. So just his breakfast, I don't remember if there was peanut butter in there, but let's say there was. His breakfast alone has like 90, almost even 100 grams of fat just for one meal. That's what people should have in the entire day, if that. So people could be saying, "Oh, I just have no appetite. Oh, I eat so much food," but you could potentially eat more calories in the whole day, pulling back on those fats and adding in more carbs that also taste good. You don't want to just be eating a bunch of, you know, boring, bland, gross shit that you don't want to eat. Put some honey on your rice, add some sauces if you want. Um, and even, switch out the carb source. If you don't want to be eating oatmeal all the time, or, switch to cream of rice, put in, some kinds of like sourdough bread, things like that. Uh, Other carb sources, even fruit, like orange juice or bananas, things like that. And that's another way to get more carbs in to where it's not negatively affecting your digestion, to where you're able to eat your next meal 2 hours later, 2.5 hours later, instead of being full for 4 hours. And yeah, you're
Hmm.
still eating a lot, but then you'd potentially be able to eat even more and be a lot fuller in terms of glycogen, not appetite, a lot more full in glycogen. Um, yeah, example, it just happened yesterday.
I mean, to add on to that, you might even realize that you don't even need to eat as much as you think you do. Because when people eat this way and there's no plan of action, they're just focused on trying to hit numbers, and they're like, oh, well, I'm not seeing that much progress. I'm always getting my calories in. You see them fucking, oh, the end of the night comes. You see this all the time. I got to have all my, I'm late on 100 grams of protein. They're getting in them half their protein intake in the day in their last meal. When you do things effectively, you have a strategic plan, you're focused on nutrient timing, you have good sources, and you're making use of those nutrients. you're going to get more out of less essentially than you would. Like if you had the perfect plan with 3,000 calories versus a shit plan with 40,000 calories, you're going to get significantly better results out of the lower caloric value just because of how you're actually utilizing those nutrients.
And adding to that, the other reason why they might respond better is because they'll actually be able to be consistent. Because it's so common where guys will say they eat a lot of food, but that's 5 days a week or 6 days a week, where maybe one or two of those days or even more, they're eating a lot less because their appetite's fucked, their digestion's fucked, and they just don't have the motivation to eat that much food or whatever it is. And then that's why they're not gaining weight, even though they eat so much food most days. Is those 1, 2, even 3 days per week that they're not eating that amount of food that's fucking them. So if they were to pull back a little bit and to give you rough numbers, let's say if you were to be eating let's say you're trying to eat 4,000 calories but you're only eating that 5 days a week, that's 20,000 calories in the week plus too much math. Anyways, that'd be like 22,000 calories for the week versus if let's say you had you know uh 4,000 or 35 whatever 100 calories every single day, that would be more calories because you're actually eating it every single day. So it's the consistency aspect of making it actually more adherable. You're actually able to adhere to it and be able to stick to it, make more progress.
You know what I can't stand? I think this is fucking it's insane. It's ridiculous. It's I when people try to use weekly equations, right? They
Oh, I
not
know.
even like the daily equation. So I missed 2 meals this week. I'm gonna make up for tomorrow. That's not how it fucking works. Again, I mean, at this point, you should understand this, but you cannot make up for it. It's not your body does not know these numbers. You can't do, I'm getting a total of 20,000 calories in all span of 7 days. It's not so eat all those
No,
calories
not
in
at
one
all.
day and see what happens. It's not how it fucking works. You cannot make up for a missed meal.
No. So that's because of meal timing, but also your body adapts. So, and your metabolism adapts. So, if you were to pull back on the food unintentionally by missing some meals, that's not the exact same thing as if you're to be getting those meals in the entire time. Or I should rephrase that and I should say, if you, let's say, missed a meal one day and then you get that meal in the next day, that's not going to have the same exact effect as if you were to just get the actual meals in on time. Even though it's the same amount of calories in both days, the meal time is going to be way off. If you were to put two meals together on the second day and you had one less on the first day, you're not going to be able to partition those nutrients from that huge meal of 2 in 1 the same way as you would just normally partition that. Or by partition I mean be able to push those nutrients into the muscle or into the fat the same way. You'd push more into the fat because you can't absorb as many into the muscle at a time if it's way too much food at a time. So that's why it's better to just spread it out evenly, every day, eat your meals on time. Versus the extreme example is, let's say you're eating 5 meals a day 7 days a week, that's 35 meals a week. Imagine you ate 35 meals all on the seventh day. Do you think if you went 6 days of fasting and then ate 35 meals worth of food, a week's worth of food in one day, that you'd have the exact same effect? Obviously not. You'd be fasting, you'd be getting really depleted, and it might be beneficial in terms of, not in this extreme example of just pulling back. It's carb cycling, you're pulling back, pushing up, pulling back, pushing up. But also, if you were to be just depriving yourself of food while you're trying to be in a surplus, and then you just over consume, a lot of that's going to be stored as fat. Versus if you were to just spread that out evenly over the week, less of it would be converted into fat. That's what I'm
To
saying.
add on to that, this is another thing that I get asked all the time, and sometimes, sometimes I'll be okay if the person's eating a very low caloric diet, they're in a deficit or whatever. But again, I don't know how many times I'm going to keep reiterating this: is when you are eating, you're eating for a purpose. You're trying to make the most use of those nutrients. You're trying to generate a certain response. Like you could look at any meal plan, you could say, why is this meal here? And I could tell you why that meal is there at that point. It's not just randomized. It's not just all over the place. So people will often say, I'm cramped. Can I have 2 meals at the same time? Can I, can join these meals into one? In some cases, it could be fine.
Yeah.
But if we're talking about somebody who's pushing food, let's give an example. Just 8 ounces of chicken and 300 grams of rice, and maybe some avocado in there. There, say there's two of those meals. Can I just conjoin that into one? You're not going to get the same response if you put that all into one meal. A lot of that is probably going to get stored as fat. Would you agree?
It depends on the person's level of glycogen, their insulin sensitivity, and how much food that is relative to them. So, yeah, if you said they're pushing food, let's say they're deep into a bulking phase, they're a little bit higher in body fat, they're full of glycogen, then yes, I would agree. Where it's hard to keep storing more and more glycogen, you're already kind of tapped out. So, to be able to push all that food at once, especially if it uh, digests or if it digests quickly, is let's say it's lower in fat um, and higher in carbs, it might be more converted more into fat because less of it can be stored into the muscle. Um, then there's the similar idea that I see is very common where people will say, "Oh, I can't get my meals in. I'm gonna go have a cheat meal instead," and they're combining two meals into one that way. Where obviously it's better to do it with what you said, which is eat your meals just close together. That's better than saying, you know what, I'm gonna just go get some Five Guys. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
gonna stick to my chicken and rice. I'm gonna go get some Five Guys instead because I need the calories. That's the easy way to put on body fat for the one reason that you're saying, which is you can't absorb all of those nutrients into the muscle at one time. You need to spread it out, but also you're getting way more fats if you're getting it from a restaurant, especially if it's from burger and fries and the cheese and all that on there. That's not in your normal meal plan, not in your normal macros. You're not going to you're going to put on body fat from that. It's inevitable. Now whether you see it the next day, just it depends. But if you're doing that every week or frequently, that's a very easy way to kind of fuck with your insulin sensitivity and put on fat a lot quicker, is having those cheat meals. Even though you're placing two meals with it, it's still going to be probably more calories than those two meals
Mm-hmm.
and more
Yeah, I mean,
fats.
I think we did a whole section on that in a previous podcast. I feel like we did, right?
I don't remember. I've been talking about too much stuff.
But
It's a
I
lot
mean,
more
I know
fats.
people will see like bodybuilders do that and stuff, and take into consideration that's not you. You don't know what the fuck's going on. I have a bunch of guys where I'll allow free meals in the off season on a weekly basis, but again, they're strategically planned for the most part. It's not just like, oh, if you miss two meals, just throw this in there.
Right.
It might be after having a very low carb day, so I know they're going to be more sensitive. At the end of the day, okay, you could have Five Guys, like, because I know the likelihood of that being stored is less likely if they were just throwing it in and replacing it after trying to conjoin two meals in some randomized fashion. So there is a way to do things in a way that it makes sense, in a way that it's not going to be at a point where it's going to contribute to more resistance, I guess you could say, in some
Hmm.
aspects. But you just need to know what you're doing, right? But let's go into who the type of person that, like, in what scenarios somebody could benefit from having these higher fats implemented into their protocol. But again, it still has to be in a controlled fashion, not just randomly throwing oil into your shakes for the sake of calories. We established that by now.
Yeah. So somebody who eats a lot of food, consistently, and they need to eat a lot of food consistently, um, to where they can't eat enough carbs. They, like the more carbs, doesn't matter. They need the fats just to get the calories in. Where they're eating as many carbs as possible, but they still need more food just to be able to even maintain their weight. That's definitely a type of person who would benefit more from, let's say, having a fattier protein source. Let's say to have you know
A ribeye.
a ribeye or 90-10 beef or 85-15 versus getting 93-7, 96-4. They don't need the extra lean red meat sources. Also throwing in peanut butter, almond butter, nuts, olive oil, avocado oil, avocados and guacamole, things like that. Having those fat sources in the meals on top of what they're already eating, not in place. So they're already eating, three, four, five, 600 grams of rice in a meal, plus the fats, just to get the extra calories in. Now, there, it really depends because ideally they would eat less fats and more carbs. But the reality is some people just got to do with what they can do, deal with what they can work with. And so if they've just been trying for years and they just know that they have trouble eating 6 meals a day or even 5 meals a day, and they, just for whatever reason, they work a busy job, whatever it is, and they just need to get the food in, they can only eat 4 big meals a day. For them, it might make sense to, throw a little extra fats in there if they're already eating a shit ton of carbs, uh, just to be able to store those carbs as glycogen instead of just burning through them, throwing a little extra fats on top of it. So that's where I would say it makes sense, is to throw fats on top of the meal, literally throw it on top of the meal. Uh, but
Hmm.
I wouldn't say that like going in the extreme direction of just eating all the fattiest foods that you can, of all the fried foods, fast food, ice cream, dirty bulking. That's not really where you can see a lot of benefit. It's going to be the whole foods, high carbs, high protein, and then for that type of person, throwing in more fats just so they can continue to be full of glycogen, um, to benefit their workouts.
Hmm. So again, it just comes back to the hierarchy that I mentioned before. Like if I had to start somebody from the base, and this is the problem, is a lot of people don't want to do this, right? Because I know I need 4,000 calories. How can I build a plan doing that? Like it's not going to work. You just start at a point and build your way up and titrate up. So most people again, they can't even handle that volume of food when
Yeah,
they're eating the way they should be. They start with base amount of protein. How much protein do we need? Say
yeah,
300 grams. Get all your protein sources in, and then maybe at that point, uh, yeah, I'll start on very low carbs or even little carb, no carbs if I have to. Then at that point, start introducing carbs. Once I'm introducing a moderate amount of carbs, I'll start to introduce a moderate amount of fats, just not a lot, just a little bit, just for again like the basic hormonal function. Throw some avocado in there, maybe some nuts, and then at that point, I'm basically just titrating carbs up to as much as we need, as that person can tolerate for their goals, and not allowing them to become resistant, not allowing them to accumulate an excessive amount of body fat. But then if it gets to the point where this person ends up being one of those super high metabolically functioning individuals, then they're maxed out on this carb intake, proteins where it's at, they already have a moderate amount of fats. Then the last thing that I would do is, start to add in higher fats on top of that.
right. And then not to confuse that with somebody who's, let's say, eating a lot of food, but they need an extra bump in food, what from whatever source to continue progressing in the gym. I would try to add more carbs somehow. Whether you're throwing in, the honey, the fruit juices. If they're already eating enough rice to where it's like I can't eat any more rice, throw those easy carb sources in there, or even also throw in other carb sources. Like the palate is a real thing. You want it to taste good, so what I've found that also works is I'll throw in some sourdough toast in with the meal, or people can even do like English muffins if they wanted to. They don't need to have like for the first meal just oatmeal. Like you can have oatmeal with toast. You can put some rice in there. You could do oatmeal and cream of rice. You could do, for other meals, you could do rice and potatoes. For one of my meals, I do spaghetti, but for the noodles, I use rice noodles. So the ingredient is only rice. And then I have sourdough toast with it, and so it's just an easy way to get more carbs into where it tastes better and I can eat more food. And even though it's still whole foods, it's more calories without adding just more rice. So that's another way that I would go about it. But generally I would try to just add more carbs. I wouldn't really try to, if we're looking at what nutrient are we going to throw in to continue progressing, throwing in more fats generally isn't going to have much of an effect on improving your training performance. For someone who just isn't eating very many fats at all, and can't eat any more carbs at all, then yes, it makes sense to throw in more fats. Um, but I would always say if you're trying to increase your calories over time, it's generally going to come from carbs, because the protein is roughly going to stay the same. You're not really going to be increasing protein in an off season. Maybe over time you could, but really it's going to come in, you're going to increase your protein in a deficit, honestly, just for muscle retention and also for appetite or satiety. But in an off season, in a bulking phase, you really should only be increasing the carbs. I don't see a reason for a normal person to be increasing their fats, because really that's just going to be stored as more body fat
Yeah. No,
directly.
I rarely have any cases where that even happens. I mean, I don't know where you're at, but I could say I can confidently say for the vast majority of my clients, their fats are going to be, even regardless of their caloric intake, their fats are going to be anywhere on the low end from like 40, 45 to the high end is like 70, 75. That's like the high that really, like, I really rarely get past that unless somebody's really pushing food.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't really calculate the macros generally, but I would say when I have, um, most of the time, percentage wise, their fats are about 15 to 20% of their total calories, sometimes higher than 20, up to 25%. But I would say for a majority of the time, it's going to be around 20%, maybe closer down to 15. For a woman, though, I would say I give them more fats. They usually
Yeah.
benefit, especially in a deficit. I'll give them more fats, get closer to 25, even higher, closer to 30%. But
Yeah. Well, I'll typically do higher fats on their rest days because I'll typically do very low
yeah,
carbs or no carbs, like I said, on the rest days until we have a bigger meal. But
yeah,
that's mostly for satiation more than anything, so that they're not starving throughout that day.
yeah,
But again, when we're coming back to increasing fats, if you feel like you can no longer push food, it's not like that should also just be the first course of action, because there could also be other things to look at. This is given the scenario that everything else is nailed down beforehand. Like, there could be other contributing factors as to why you're not able to eat more and why your appetite is in the
oh,
gutter. Like,
totally.
you could check your blood glucose and see how you're actually digesting that food. How much fiber are you actually having? Like, look at the sources of protein that you're having. Red meat, things like that. They're gonna take longer to break down than something like white fish or chicken or shrimp. Those things are gonna be quicker digesting, and that could ultimately be affecting your ability to eat more carbs too. So there's a lot of different avenues you need to explore before you just jump the gun and say, I need more calories and they need to be from fat.
Oh yeah, 100%. Insulin sensitivity is a huge one when it comes to your appetite. Have you just put on too much body fat? That simply could be negatively affecting your appetite. And then also one that people don't talk about is going to be the emotional side of things. If your life is stressful, if you're having relationship problems, whatever it is, that can also negatively affect your appetite. And it's not necessarily the food, your body fat levels, whatever. It's simply just stress and anxiety negatively affecting your appetite, and that's also pretty common.
Yeah.
So,
But this is the cool thing about bodybuilding, because if you're actually a good bodybuilder, I don't mean you have to be like a competitive bodybuilder, but if you're somebody who is, just gets their shit done, is on top of their meals, is on top of their training, you're taking this seriously and you're not just fucking around. The thing about this lifestyle, let's just say fitness in general, is that if you know what's going on, it's very easy to eliminate variables and figure out the root problem of things if you just have base understandings of how these things work, or even if you just outsource to somebody else, because now you have this data collected and you say, I've been eating this every single day consistently on my training days, on my rest days. I never really deviate from it. I do this much cardio. This is what my training looks like. And you can take the steps necessary to figure out what the problem is. When you're doing random shit all the time, going to Five Guys, you're taking 3 days off this week, 2 days off that week, and all these external things are going on outside of your control, it's very hard to figure out why your digestion is shit, why your appetite isn't good. When you have everything controlled, you have more control.
that is the reason to not do IIFYM and to not just track macros, because I hear it all the time like, I can just track macros. That's the reason why, because you don't have consistency. Now, of course, you can track macros and then create a meal plan based on those macros, but then at the end of the day, you're just creating a meal plan. So there's no difference. So it's totally okay to know the macros of your foods and of your day, of your calorie intake. That's perfectly fine to know those numbers. I'm saying that it doesn't matter. And the reason why it doesn't matter is because then it gives people the freedom to make changes every single day to their diet, which is exactly what you're saying. Because then they're not going to see the consistency. They're going to have fluctuations in their digestion, in their absorption, in their calorie intake as well, because also the food labels around their calories and macros. And then also, you're not going to be absorbing the nutrients the exact same way from this food versus this food, chicken versus a protein bar. So, it's not just about the macronutrient intake, and it's also about consistency. That's really what matters when it comes to bodybuilding. If you're trying to take it seriously and put on muscle tissue and get fucking jacked, you want to take it seriously, and because it is your physique, it is your life, and it just only makes sense to do that, to have the consistency, because then that translates into all the other aspects of your life. By having your shit on, being on top of your shit here, in your diet, in your cardio, in your training, supplements, all of that, that's going to translate into whatever else you do: work, school, relationships, if you're on top of one thing, you're going to be on top of other things, especially with just your diet. That's one thing you can really be in control of. And just having a meal plan, a structured meal plan, working with somebody, especially, having a coach is going to make it a lot easier for you to actually be consistent and figure out when things are going wrong and how to fix them.
This is something that I could kind of go off on a little tangent about. I think most of the viewers here are people who are interested in bodybuilding seriously. So
Yeah.
I don't think that should be a hard thing to understand. But then I guess there will be the question of, well, what if you're just general population, you're just trying to be fit, have a fitness lifestyle? Like you should have more flexibility and things of that nature. And I would agree. Like you don't need to be as meticulous, as serious, but ultimately the same things apply. Like something goes wrong, digestion goes wrong. What happens? Now you need to do an elimination diet. You need to keep things consistent. You need to control all the variables. So even if you are just trying to be fit and have this general lifestyle and don't want to be as meticulous, you still need to have some level of consistency. You shouldn't be having random things all the time. You should, you're honestly going to have to experiment and see, if there's certain foods you figure out you don't digest well, stay away from those, take note of that. But you could have some things you rotate between, some general things you stick to as base core principles in your diet. So this way again, when things arise, you have control and it's not like everything's out the window. And this is also why, this is where I'm going to go into the little tangent here, is this is how the pharmaceutical industry operates, is because the vast majority of people have no control over their lives and there's so many external variables that they can't account for. So when you go to a doctor, they're not going to fucking put you on a plan. They don't know what's going on. So the quick solution is just a medication here. This is what fixes the symptom, but it doesn't actually address any root cause, address the root issue. And this is obviously, that's a whole issue within itself. But if people just had their shit narrowed down on a lot of these cases, I'm not going to say for everything because people are going to extrapolate that and use that for some crazy example. But in a lot of these cases, people would be able to eliminate these variables on their own, figure shit out, and be able to fix digestive issues or whatever, rather than just throwing some medication on it and saying, oh, this is going to fix my stomach acid or whatever. When really, like, did you need that to begin with? And is that even making anything better? Or is it really just causing more issues in the long run?
100%. I was going to say something too. So for those general lifestyle people, you don't necessarily need to eat the exact same thing every single day. But I would say that you don't necessarily need to eat random things every single day. I think a great balance for a lot of people is to just have different food options, or even to have a food bank of foods that digest well, and you can make changes to them if you need to. If let's
Ice
say,
cream.
huh? What'd you say?
I said ice cream.
Oh, well,
Ben and Jerry's.
If you're Rich Piana, you could eat Ben and Jerry's. But, if let's say you have a base diet, that's generally what I will come up with for any client, is have a base diet. And then depending on what they want to do, they could either stick to that diet every single day, or they can make changes to it by, switching out their, rice for toast or potatoes, or whatever the carb source is, or the protein source. You don't want to switch out ground beef for steak or salmon or chicken for shrimp, things like that. Like, you can switch things out in your diet, of course, and still make progress, because the macros are going to be basically the same. It's going to digest basically the same. But if you're switching them out for protein bars and these processed foods that you're finding at the store, like these low carb tortillas and whatever kind of bullshit you can think of that has a million ingredients, it's not going to be the same thing. And especially if you're switching them out for restaurant meals that you're tracking the macros of, because Chipotle, Taco Bell, they're not using a food scale to measure out how much meat they're giving you or how much food they're giving you. So it's not going to be very accurate doing that, but you can still have flexibility with your diet and still use macros or substitution to make changes to it. There's just an extent to where it becomes inaccurate.
Yeah. That would all the whenever you go out to eat, just assume it's inaccurate. But even if you
100%.
even if you are a bodybuilder, there still could be some level of flexibility there. But again, it just comes down to understanding what the food's purpose is and is doing at that time, right? You're not going to go and have eggs and meat every morning and then substitute that for Kodiak cakes because Kodiak cake has protein in it. It's not the same fucking thing. Not going to get the same job done. If you're having cream of rice before you train, are you going to substitute that for oatmeal? Maybe if you have a small amount, but if it's a large amount, it's a shit ton of fiber. It's going to slow digestion down. It's not going to be a good carb source. Maybe if it was meal one, but this is, again, understanding the timing and the importance of that. So there can be flexibility. You just need to understand these things.
Yeah, I also had one of my clients who's a female. She asked me, and she's in a surplus. She's bulking right now, and she said she wanted to eat some sour candy, and I said, sure, you can, throw it in pre workout, tomorrow before you train. She wants to eat this craving, whatever. Throw it in pre workout. No, I want it right now. I want it right now before bed at night. After I've already, trained earlier. It doesn't make any sense. So, there's a time and place to implement certain foods and nutrients, even if it's, some bullshit like sour candy. Uh, but I think, having that understanding of when this can actually be beneficial and throwing in, let's say some sour candy pre workout or having, you know, a burger, whatever cheat meal, sushi post workout, that can be better partitioned into muscle versus into fat. And so
Hmm.
that's how we can optimize our physique with these foods by using them, with having timing in mind. Again, not just calories in, calories out, but timing and digestibility also matter.
Hmm. Do you want to touch on the different types of fats at all, or you think it's gonna be a whole thing?
Um, I mean, we can. We've been on this for hour and 20 minutes or something like that.
Let's briefly cover it too. So the importance of this too, because this whole topic is really revolved around fat. Is
Yeah.
not only we're talking about the quality of foods, but there's different types of fats as well, and how that really can play an impact on your biomarkers, on your actual health internally, right? Because not all fat is created equally. And you don't want to have cholesterol issues and increase your risk for cardiovascular disease. So there's obviously saturated fats, unsaturated fats. You're going to be able to articulate this better. So why don't you go over the different types here?
Well, as I was telling you before, there's MUFAs and PUFAs.
Yeah.
Those are the abbreviations for monounsaturated monounsaturated fatty acids and polyunsaturated fatty acids. I could get into the science of what that means. It has to do with the chemical structure, basically. So there's those mono and poly unsaturated fats, and then the saturated fats. So you're going to generally find saturated fats in red meat, dairy, things like that, and then the unsaturated fats, the mono and poly, or the MUFAs and PUFAs, those are going to be in oils, in nuts, avocados, things like that. So fruit oils, plant oils, seed oils, and then that brings into the whole discussion of seed oils versus red meat. And so it's a whole discussion, a whole controversy of some people are, I'd say, in three camps. One in the seed oils are terrible. They're the devil. They are, the worst thing you could possibly consume. They're bleached. They're, whatever, used with hexane. And avoid seed oils at all costs while they're still injecting tren. And then there's people in the other
Wait,
camp.
wait, 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 wait. Are you saying that because like it's ironic because they're injecting the drug, or because the drug
Both.
has the oil?
Both.
Okay.
Yeah, because you're already injecting seed oils, but they're like you're injecting grapeseed oil or you know actual seed oils.
Which gets absorbed too by the
Yeah,
body.
so you're literally injecting yourself with seed oils, but you're afraid to eat it, and you're probably injecting yourself with more. But because I don't think there's like a whole milliliter of seed oils in a slice of bread, but and then the trend, steroids in general are also gonna have a huge negative effect on health. But anyways, then there's other people that say seed oils are healthy. They, in studies, uh, show that they're less atherogenic, less unhealthy, less risk for cardiovascular disease compared to red meat and saturated fats. And then there's people in the middle who just don't know anything about them at all. So, in my opinion, because like there is the obvious fact that there's studies that show that polyunsaturated fats uh, can be less harmful for cardiovascular disease and actually prevent it potentially compared to saturated fats, where saturated fats can worsen your lipid levels, your LDL, your HDL, your ApoB, all this stuff compared to unsaturated fats. My opinion is that it's a lot more nuanced than just eating seed oils versus eating red meat. There's a lot more things that go into it. So one thing that is within the seed oils and the monounsaturated, polyunsaturated fatty acids is the omega-6 fatty acids and the omega-3 fatty acids. So you can have omega-3 polyunsaturated fats and omega-6 polyunsaturated fats, and same with monounsaturated, um, where omega-6 fatty acids are going to be more inflammatory. They cause more inflammatory cytokines and just inflammatory markers to be released into the bloodstream, causing more systemic inflammation in the body, and that's going to cause a lot more health issues. We already know that inflammation in general and high blood pressure and all this stuff can negatively affect insulin sensitivity as well. And then we also know that these, high blood pressure, insulin resistance, these also go hand in hand with cardiovascular disease. It's all just metabolic syndrome, metabolic disease. So if we're talking about the increased omega-6 to omega-3 ratio from seed oils, then yes, seed oils are bad. The argument of how they're made, I can understand it. Yeah, having to extract this amount of oil from these tiny little seeds, and you're getting large amounts of oils using these toxic chemicals to, extract them. I think, this is my opinion, I think the method of actually getting the oils doesn't actually matter. I think what really matters is just you don't necessarily need to eat them for the health benefit. There's no health benefit that you're going to get from eating those versus just from eating natural foods. So I'm not scared of what, scientists and food manufacturers have been able to come up with in order to get these oils from foods using chemicals that everybody says are toxic. That's not what scares me. And seeing the videos of how they produce, canola oil and things like that. It's more just about having a balance with everything and not just being dumb with your food choices. Just actually thinking, okay, well, this processed food has, seed oils, but this processed food doesn't. I'm probably going to pick the one that doesn't.
Yeah.
But if it's a food that I want to eat and it happens to have a seed oil in there, I'm not going to say, oh, that's it. That's going to poison me. I can't eat that. So like I'll eat a Rice Krispie treat, or I'll eat, like people go to Chipotle, like that has seed oils. Like people go to, restaurants, any restaurant is going to cook with seed oils 99% of the time. And so just because you don't see it on the food label doesn't mean it's not there. So
Yeah.
I think it is kind of ridiculous to have like a hyper fixation on the fact that like seed oils are terrible for you. If you're eating them in large amounts all the time, then yes, you're potentially going to have more inflammation and then have more other issues, especially if you're someone that takes steroids or someone that's obese or somebody that already has other health issues. I think it makes sense to try to avoid them at the best you can, but
Hmm.
not to be completely scared where it's ruining your life and not eating foods that you want to eat.
Yeah. So, like you said, it really just comes down to why would I opt for something that has this when the alternative has that? And in my opinion, these seed oils really have like no place in a diet, and like the one we're referring to. Like, why would you put that in a diet? There's no use for it. But
I'll
then,
give you an example. Um, let's say the hard gainer, somebody who just needs to eat a lot of food and they have a low appetite for whatever
Mhm,
reason. Let's
mhm.
say they are dopamine resistant, whatever it is. Um, if you need to throw in certain foods like Rice Krispie treats, for example, or certain breads like sourdough bread is perfectly fine, but
Yeah. So okay, you're talking about things that have, yeah, they have seed oil in them. I'm talking about like direct fat sources, right? Like, why would I not just use avocado or extra virgin olive oil?
oh, well, in that case, it's like that's a stupid,
Yeah, why would I use canola oil over avocado oil? But
yeah.
people,
So
it's it.
that's the exact reason. Like what I'm saying is like if you have a choice between just cooking with one oil versus the other, obviously choose the healthier oil. One that's higher in omega threes, lower in omega sixes, going to have less inflammation, and is less toxic. And
Mhm.
then the other reasons of like how it's manufactured, how they get it, still like how do you extract oil out of an avocado or out of an olive? Like I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to get it out of a canola seed either. So like, people saying like, oh, it's the processing of how you get it is what's scary. That's not what concerns me. It's the actual fact of the omega 3s and omega 6s that are in them versus, let's say red meat, for example, where, they say red meat is bad for cholesterol levels and bad for your LDL, bad for your ApoB,
Mhm.
HDL,
Well,
all these.
what they said that the red meat, the saturated fat, is worse than seed oils. Is that what they said?
That's what the studies are saying. But a
Yeah.
huge problem with it is that they aren't specifying if they're grass-fed beef or grain-fed, and what the
Hmm.
cows' lives were like. Are they pasture raised, or are they living in a little a little pen, whatever you call it,
You know
where they're
what's
not able to
funny?
move?
I've seen even some of these science based guys advocate for like regular red meat because there's no difference. It's the same thing. They never notice a difference, and the difference is clear as day. I mean, we just talked about this before. How the cow is raised, how the animal is raised. The diet they're fed completely changes their omega 3 to omega 6 ratio, and that along coincides with how inflammatory it is as well. I mean, I think the first person I really got this from was probably Phil, like years ago, when he really like pushed grass-fed red meat over and over again because so many people will eat red meat and just feel like shit afterwards. And then you go over to grass-fed red meat, stops happening. It's
Yeah.
because of that the the omegas in it, the how that cow is raised and how just fucking toxic one is versus the other. I mean, that's obviously going to vary across the board, but in a general sense, grass fed is always going to be much more easily digestible. It's going to have higher omega 3s. It's going to be a much healthier source, but people just put red meat into this camp as itself and don't distinct the difference. And then they just give it a bad name in general.
So to add on to that, the cows that are living good lives, eating healthy diets, grass-fed, grass-finished cows, the grass that they're eating, grass has omega-3 fatty acids in it. So that's going into their body, and that's gonna be in their muscle and in their fat, and well, mainly in their fat, and that's going to translate into our bodies where we're eating more omega-3s. And so that's the problem with these studies is they're not showing that. Well, there are studies that show grass-fed cows have more omega-3s and less omega-6s, and vice versa. Grain-fed cows have more omega-6s, the inflammatory fatty acids. But they're not saying, probably for an agenda, propaganda reasons, that red meat, grass-fed red meat, actually isn't that bad in terms of affecting your overall health. Now, if we're talking about it increasing your LDL, yes, eating saturated fat will probably increase your LDL a little bit. For some people, a lot more, depending on how much red meat you eat. But also, just LDL levels in general aren't the sole contributor to cardiovascular disease. There's a few other risk factors that go into it. The main one being apolipoprotein B. So LDL, when you look at LDL on blood work, you're looking at LDL cholesterol, or how much cholesterol in your body is bound to the LDL particles, or bound by LDL. And so that's showing you, something. It's showing you how much cholesterol is in your LDL. If you have more LDL particles, you're generally going to have more cholesterol. Not always. Um, and then vice versa. You could have, larger particles of LDL and smaller particles holding more or less cholesterol. So it's not a direct way to show, uh, you know, the direct, atherogenic risk for cardiovascular disease and atherosclerosis. But if you look at apolipoprotein B or ApoB, that's more indicative of it, where you're able to see directly because there's one molecule of ApoB on each LDL particle. So that will directly tell you how many LDL particles do you have. And so that's more indicative of your risk for cardiovascular disease is testing your ApoB. And so, yes, a lot of red meat can also affect it. Um, but also, what matters is your HDL. And so, if your HDL is high from being metabolically healthy, from not being overweight, from having, not taking steroids and crashing your estrogen, um, being cardiovascularly fit, uh, if you're a healthy person eating a lot of red meat, you're probably going to be fine, even with slightly elevated LDL levels. Now, if you're somebody who's unhealthy, somebody who's obese with other health issues, maybe not the best idea to be consuming a lot of red meat, even if it is grass fed. But it obviously is going to be a better choice to do grass fed over grain fed if we're talking about health. Um, but in comparison to seed oils, there's all the extremes of the carnivore diet where they're saying just eat red meat only, maybe eat some fruit if you want to, and that's the healthiest diet. Where like I'd say it's a great diet, but it could
It's not
also
the
be
healthiest.
it could be a lot healthier. You can pull back on the red meat. You don't need that much red meat, and you know its effect on
I
your
think I think
lipids.
it could be any meat. I don't think it's just red meat.
You're right. It's any meat. Yeah. But the most common I'd say is red meat.
But this is
You could eat
also
chicken.
yeah, another point is it's not just red meat. Like it's also with chicken, right? Regular chicken versus like pasture raised chicken has higher omega threes. The type of eggs
Hmm.
that you get has higher omega threes.
Hmm.
So if you're just getting all the cheap basic shit from the store, I understand some people are on a budget. That's the best they could do, and that's better than nothing. But if you can afford the better quality foods, it's not just this marketing scheme that a lot of people try to make it out to be. If you know what to look for and you're actually getting better quality products, it is worth the investment because it's your health and it will make a difference on your biomarkers, on your lab work. It will have a positive impact on you. It will improve your HDL. And as in bodybuilding, that's a huge thing, right? That's one of the things that most bodybuilders have an issue with is constantly having low HDL. So getting in, a better source of those fats, getting in omega 3s, obviously in addition, doing things like cardio, things of that nature. But if you're just opting for the cheaper source under the interpretation that it's just this marketing scheme, it's a tragedy.
And the main issue with it is people are going to be eating regular meat, not grass fed, not pasture raised, chickens, all that, um, and just grain fed, locked up in a little cage, uh, and saying that's healthier
I
than than some seed oils.
mean, I'll put it this way, and I might sound a little crazy to
Which
somebody, but
it
if
is, but
you
yeah.
if you were what's the word I'm looking for? If you were a cannibal and you had to eat somebody, would you rather eat the obese person who is chronically stressed and has a terrible diet, or would you rather eat the really fit person, let's say natural, has a great diet and has a stress-filled life? Which person do you think is going to have a better quality source of meat that you would want to eat if you had to choose between the two?
Well, 100%. Even look at a steak. You're gonna want to eat a steak that's just mostly fat versus one that has the meat. So the protein is what tastes good, and it's gonna
I
actually.
just mean I just mean the quality of the nutrients in that person's body that
Well,
you
that
would get.
too.
Yeah.
Now, also another thing is that the toxins that they're eating as well, that are in these grains and whatever feed that they're fed, that stays in the fat. And so, not only are you missing out on the benefits of the omega threes or higher omega threes in the grass fed, but you're also getting some toxins potentially in the fat that you're eating. And that's why, like for example, like pigs, like pork, it kind of grosses me out now. Where like if you just see what pigs eat, they're eating their own shit and they're rolling around in mud and they're dirty animals. That the foods that they're eating, whatever is they're eating, the toxins that's in their fat. And so like if you get a whole like ham where it's like a bunch of fat on it, that fat kind of grosses me out just because of what could be in there. So and then you eat
Yeah.
that, and then that negatively affects you because it's probably going to cause some sort of inflammation as well. Um,
You get that
yeah,
pig fucking energy in your body.
start eating your own shit too. Start oinking. Just
All right. Getting into cholesterol, I feel like that could be its own whole podcast on its own, talking about cholesterol, things of that nature. But I feel like we covered this pretty well. Anything you want to add on here?
if you eat fat, you're gonna be fat.
Yeah. Fatties
That's
or fatties.
yeah. If you eat fat, you're gonna be fat. And that's the whole point of this podcast.
Yeah. Yeah. So whoever left that comment, I hope this answers that question. You got anything going on, Adam? Anything you want to plug before we hop off?
My Instagram. I'm about to go train legs. I might start recording some gym videos eventually. So I'll be posting my workouts and stuff on there. Besides just talking about steroids.
Yeah, everybody just wants gear information from you.
I know. And I'm giving it to them. But I'm gonna try to expand a little bit and show my training too, because I'm not just some person that takes steroids and sits on the couch.
Trying to get out of the box, out of the gear box. There's more to Adam than gear.
More to bodybuilding too than just steroids.
All right, well, thanks
So
for tuning in, guys. Make sure you like this video. Make sure you are subscribed. Drop a comment down below, and we'll see you on the next episode of Brass Tack Bodybuilding.